I hope you can put up with 2 times in a month a sort of reflective type of sermon. It will get gospelly and biblically later on, but I want to start personally. The genesis of this sermon you might find very strange. A couple of weeks ago, when I was sitting at the table here, was that table actually, I was looking over at Mur and trying to get her attention halfway through a song, which is kind of unfair to do to a musician. Didn't work anyway. But it's interesting, the way the light was coming through was shining on the floor here, and it just highlighted something that is of absolutely no eternal significance, but it just got me thinking. Believe it or not, what it highlighted, and when you come up to communion you can see it, is 4 holes in the floor that were drilled with a cement drill bit. And it reminded me that this configuration of the church is not the original configuration of St. Mary's. When I first came to St. Mary's, and some of you have been here long enough to remember this, the altar was dead center under the skylight, and those are the main doors, and those were the doors people would come in though, and the pews were arranged like turn everything 90 degrees. And on that side, this is just a reminder for some of you, new information for others, on that side was enough choir pews for 60 people. And on this side was enough choir pews for 85 people. And the organ was over there, and there was this monstrous speaker console that was hanging down from the ceiling. If it had ever fallen, we would have lost half the West Island. And there was a font. It was made of cement slabs, and the altar was made of cement slabs. And it was a very 60s arrangement. That's what I came into, and these 4 holes in the floor reminded me of that. And that started me on a journey, a process of thinking about the evolutions of St. Mary's. I've known all the rectors of St. Mary's and all the assistants, and so I have a lot of input as to what the history of St. Mary's is and what it was built for and what it was built in order to accomplish. The person who St. Mary's was built, I would say because of, he was the spark plug, former Archdeacon David Conliffe, a lovely man. He came to ministry in the immediate post-war period, and in the post-war period there was a lag. There weren't enough churches because there was this expansion going on. And some of you may be old enough, perhaps, to remember coming back from the war and needing key money to get an apartment. Does that sound familiar? Do you remember that? Housing was so sparse, so rare, that not only did you have to pay your rent if you could find a place, but you actually had to pay what was called key money. It was basically a bribe, is what it amounts to. My parents, when they moved to Montreal after my dad was demobbed, they lived in a boathouse in St. Rose, winter and summer for 3 years. And my father would commute from Lower NDG to St. Rose by bus every day to go to work and to come home. And they literally had paper between the planks in the boathouse to keep out the weather. And there were other people. They were the only people living in the only boathouse. That's the way it was. And so as people came back and as the post-war expansion happened, there was this, oh my, we don't have enough churches. And so there was the big, huge, especially in Montreal and the West Island, expansion into the then burgeoning suburbs in order to build churches. And it was quite appropriate to the time, because that was an environment in which a given percentage of the population was attending church. And there's a tendency in these days to exaggerate how much of the population was attending church. In reality, and you might find this hard to believe, but if you do look it up, the statistics are clear. On a basis of population, there is very little change in percentage of people who attend church than there was back in the days when the churches were full. It's just that there were, for example, more Anglicans concentrated in one area and many fewer churches. So as the church expanded post-war and the number of parishes multiplied, there's something obvious that's going to happen because you've got a fixed population. You're going to see attendance going down in each representative parish. So, for example, if immediately after the Second World War you only had 3 parishes on the West Island, and then within 20 years you had 19 on the West Island, but the population of adults hasn't grown that much, what are you going to see? You're going to see weaker churches. Then, of course, the thing that offset that was the baby boom. And so what you had was churches which had basically a consistent adult attendance over a generation, but the churches appeared to be growing exponentially because everybody was breeding, you know. And when St. Mary's was new, the largest confirmation St. Mary's ever had was 72 people in 1 year. 72 kids in 1 year. Can you imagine that? 72 kids of confirmation age were confirmed that year at St. Mary's. How many kids were in the Sunday school? So St. Mary's, when it was built in 1968, was built with that sort of ethos. People would come into church on a Sunday and it would be noisy and it would be full of kids, and there would be a constant struggle to find Sunday school teachers because you could have a couple of hundred kids in a Sunday school. Indeed, when I went to Montreal North and Mascouche in 1981, one of the things they took pride in showing me was all the black and white pictures of Sunday school in the 50s and early 60s. There were no color pictures because by the time color photography became the way of things, attendance had gone way down and it wasn't exciting and encouraging anymore. So I would see these 8x10 glossies of a Sunday school that was meeting in the gym of the school next door, and it had over 200 kids. And there were enough people who remained from that time to remind me of those days, or to tell me of those days, remind themselves of those days. But you know what happened? Those people didn't regenerate. The culture was what caused or precipitated church attendance. It wasn't evangelism or evangelization. New people were not discovering the gospel. It was generational Christian formation as opposed to evangelistic Christian formation. And so when St. Mary's was built, that was a good point, by the way, generational as opposed to evangelistic. When St. Mary's was built, it was built with that ethos in mind. And so it was built for a day that just never happened. St. Mary's was never full. There never were 60 people in the choir over there and 85 people in the choir over here. It just never happened. And the pews were never full. And that's not because St. Mary's people were bad people, or it was an unfriendly church, or there was something wrong with the place. It's just because it was built for demographics that didn't exist. Now, instead of recognizing that reality, you know what we did? What do people do when something's going wrong in their life that they don't want to take responsibility for? Shift blame. And we had one of the biggest scapegoats to bless Christendom in this dear province of Quebec, René Lévesque. He became the locus of all our problems. The Parti Québécois and the separatist movement and the FLQ and 1976, the election, became the focus, the root of all the Anglo's problems. Our churches were emptying because of the Parti Québécois. Everybody was leaving for Ontario because of the Parti Québécois. We were losing everything that we treasured because of the separatist movement. And you know what? It's not true. It's not true. I could argue this with you, not now, but I would be happy to argue with you that the Parti Québécois was not a cause, it was an effect. What it was an effect of is the building of the St. Lawrence Seaway. Because once the St. Lawrence Seaway was built, Montreal could be bypassed as a center of commerce and merchanting. You didn't need Montreal anymore. And so the money started to move, industry started to move to the Midwest. And when you think of it, think of where the strength of America is in terms of its industrial power. Think of the Great Lakes. Think of Detroit, Windsor, and that whole corridor in there. And so all of a sudden you could see all these huge freighters bypassing Montreal. They didn't need to stop here anymore. And into that, from that emerged the sovereigntist movement in the way we came to understand it. Now, a lot of people saw that this was what was happening and tried to do something about it. And there was this guy, you might recognize the name, Trudeau the Elder. He had a plan that he was going to stop what he saw fermenting in Quebec by making Quebec once again a center of commerce and industry and merchandising and all the rest of it. And you know what that was, right? Can we all shout it out together, please? Mirabel Airport. Thank you. That was Trudeau's response to what was happening. All this land that was expropriated, this huge airport. And you know what? The highway to it never was completed, and you can discover that today. So you see, we were living in an effect, not a cause, but we were blaming the Parti Québécois for what was happening in the churches as if they were the cause. They weren't. They were a contributing factor. But what was happening was society was changing. It's almost as if, and I've said this sort of semi-jokingly numerous times, it's almost as if collectively people in the Western world woke up one Sunday morning and said, excuse the language, you're all grown-ups except for my kids and Yana's kids, why the hell are we going to church? You know, we're busy. We're working 5 or 6 days a week. We've got soccer and football and hockey and, you know, quilting and, you know, everything else that we do. Why are we getting up on a Sunday morning and going to church? And it's almost as if just in a couple of years, everything was different. Now, during those years, when people had this collective, why are we doing this? I was still in my last days at St. Columba. And I remember when the Servers Guild, and that's a word that you don't hear often in the church anymore, Servers Guild was commissioned. There were somewhere between 20 and 30 of us in purple cassocks and white surplices. By the time I left St. Columba's to go into seminary 3 years later, there were 2, me and Gerald Batt. And Gerald Batt left the year that I left. There was no Servers Guild anymore. And you sort of say, something major, some earthquake had to have happened for so much to happen so quickly. And then instead of trying to discover what that was, what we did was we started doing what people often do when the reality that they're experiencing is not the reality they want. Magical thinking. Magical thinking. You know, very often sentences that start with the words, if only, are sentences about magical thinking. If only parents taught their children, if only parents brought their kids to Sunday school. But you know what? It's never if only I. It's always if only they, or if only you. Things would be different. So there was magical thinking. When I was ordained in the early years, some of the people who I worked with were forward thinkers, some were magical thinkers. And I remember when I went to St. George's and St. Anne de Bellevue, The minister there, his name was Jim McLean. He was a lovely, lovely man, a very caring man, but he was a magical thinker. The first meeting that he and I had, and the reason I went to St. George's having already had a curacy, was because I was just married and Jim had had a heart attack. Not that the two were related. But the bishop figured that he needed somebody not raw out of school to train from the get-go. He needed somebody with some experience who can be independent, and that, you know, a new marriage and a new, otherwise I would have been rector of a new parish, and the bishop didn't think that would be fair on the marriage or the parish. So he put Jim and me together and pronounced us, you know, rector and curate. Jim wasn't used to having somebody with experience. He was used to molding the clay from a lump, as opposed to lumpy clay that had already been semi-molded. And so the first thing he did was the first thing he did with every one of his curates. He handed me a booklet. Well, it wasn't a booklet, it was a binder. It wasn't a huge binder, it was a binder of about that size. And it was full of little cards that you sort of put it in order. And what this was the visiting book. And so the idea was I was to go out on my afternoons and I was to visit the parish list, you know, one after another after another. And those cards were so that I could write the date of the visit. And you should all be thinking, ooh, what's that serving? The date of the visit, any particular notes, and anything else that I wanted to put in there. And I looked at this, and I looked at the parish list, and I saw that both were a fantasy. It was absolutely obvious to me that both were a fantasy of a church that didn't exist. Because the last time the parish list had been updated was 3 years before I had arrived at the parish. So it was a fantasy. Anything 3 years old on the West Island in terms of who's who and where's where, who's where and where's who, is a fantasy. It's too transient an area. So I looked at the parish list, and in those days it was the day of Gestetner machines. It's not like a computer where you could go in and make your deletions and additions every month. And so parish lists weren't done very frequently. And occasionally you'd get a name scratched out. Occasionally you'd get a name ballpoint penned in on the opposite side, because Gestetner only did one side. And this book, I don't know who had last updated it, but I just don't know. I just don't know. And I talked to Jim about why. Like, why do you want me to, you know, just go and call on people like that? And he wanted me to walk the streets of Il Perot in Pangor. Why? Like, what's the goal? What's the purpose? And he looked at me as if I'd landed from Mars. Because that's what you do. It's what you do. You go and you knock on people's doors, and you do. But why? What are we trying to accomplish here? Like, what's the purpose of this? Got no answer. It's just, that's what ministers did. Now, I think there was a time when that type of contact might have served a purpose, when people were motivated to come to church, to have their kids baptized, confirmed, to get married, to be buried, etc., etc., etc. Those times were rapidly disappearing. And so I did something that I look back on it now, and I'm sure my attitude wasn't the most mature. I'm sure it was rather cocky, and I wanted to make a point and all sorts of immature things. But I decided to update my visiting book. And by phone call and by visiting, reduced the number of entries from over 430 to just under 250. These were people that we were looking at on paper who didn't exist, who had moved away, who had been added because they had attended a party or a dinner at the church, who had died, and there was just no updating going on. So when you did update, the reality was far different from what the fantasy was. And that was not well received in the parish, because of course the next thing I did was I translated my visiting book to the parish list. And I took a copy of the parish list and scratched off all the names of people that were no longer there. Now, I know my attitude wasn't the best, and I'm sure, I'm positive, I must have done that with some cockiness. But there was a part of me, like a real part of me, that said, how can you possibly be a church unless you're dealing with reality? And that's when I realized that many people in the church don't want to deal with reality. They want to deal with fantasy. They want to deal with the fantasy about what the church is. They want to deal with the fantasy of what their own lives are. And they want to deal with the fantasy about what the society around them is. And when you look at Jesus and his life and what he did and how he did it, Jesus, amongst the many, many, many things that we could say about him and do, he was the disillusioner. He was the one who stripped away the illusions that people had and brought them face to face with the hardcore guts and glory of what it means to be human. He made us see what it was like to be humanity at its worst. And he made us see what it was like to be humanity at its best. He made us look at our preconceptions. He made us look at our presuppositions and our assumptions. And he did not leave one of them unchallenged. Remember the story of the woman at the well. He would probably, and she certainly, would still be killed in parts of the Middle East today for having that conversation that he had with her. Oh, we're much more sophisticated in North America. We don't speak of stoning women. We speak of having a glass ceiling. And oh, aren't we glad that Hillary is now here to break the glass ceiling? We speak of racism, and we talk about how Canada isn't nearly as bad as America is. This is a claim to fame? Excuse me? We're not as bad as America is? Like, what words can describe that attitude? Well, yes, he hit me again, but if I hadn't done da-da-da-da-da-da, he wouldn't have. Excuse me? Excuse me? How would that stand up in light of him who was the advocate of the marginalized, the outcasts, the impoverished, those who were the lowest of the low according to their society's standards? One of my hopes is that as we look at the state that the church is in now, we have the courage, and I think it really will take courage, to look at the church in light of the gospel as opposed to in light of our past. That's not to say we forget the past or ignore it or don't learn from it or any of those things, but that we don't live in it and try to recreate it. There is one person who is a member of this congregation who once said, with a smile and not with any malice, but just said it, that, well, when I leave or when I retire, we shouldn't get rid of all the pews because we may need them again for our new choir, thinking that the reason there's no choir Sunday by Sunday is because I don't want one. That's not it, folks. The reason why we don't have a choir is because it's a different day. It's a different age. More and more churches have no choirs. Well, I could go on choirs for a while, but I would distract myself. So St. Mary's was built for a time that never happened, and we are not alone. In the past month, I've heard of 2 parishes on the West Island that are going down to half-time clergy because of financial constraints. If we hadn't gone on half-time because of my health, we would have been on half-time because of financial constraints. And you know what? I hate to tell you, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that might be a good thing. I think that maybe one of the things that God is showing the church is that we have been clergy-ridden for a long time. and that the people of God, which we've called the laos or the laity, really need to discover their ministry. I said to somebody a while ago that clergy are really supportive and positive about lay ministry right up until the laity start to minister. Because you know what happens? When you unleash the laity, when you say, you folks can do it, you folks have competencies and skills that I don't have and never will. I have different ones. But you have stuff that I never will have. You find that people actually do it. You find that your laity actually can form pastoral relationships, can counsel, can preach. Richard, Bethany, who else? They can do it. They can do it. But you know what? All of this implies a letting go. There was a time in my early days here, and there was this lovely person, a person of wit and humor and strength of character and attitude. Oh, attitude, though she did it with such a smile, named Pat Roberts. Pat was my mentor. I loved Pat. The more I came to learn of Pat's life from Pat, the more shocked I became. And I'll never forget, and I'll say this and I'll say it quickly, but there's much more to the story. Sitting in the lounge one day, talking with management of the parish, when my first marriage was ending, and Pat talked about her divorce. And I don't know if anyone in that room knew that Pat Roberts had been divorced. I learned so much from Pat. And one of the things that I learned was that sometimes you just got to take advantage of the moment. There was one year where Pat was the head of the Ladies' Guild at St. Mary's. And it was elections. And nobody wanted to stand to be head of the Ladies' Guild at St. Mary's. And so she called for the elections and called for nominations, and nobody agreed to stand. And she then said, well, fine, I guess we don't have a Ladies' Guild anymore, and dismissed the group. And that was the end of the Ladies' Guild at St. Mary's. And what she said, Lorne, it wasn't serving any purpose, but they didn't know that yet. Isn't that wise? Isn't that wise? She was willing to let it go. You got to be willing to let some things go. We still speak of a flower guild, an altar guild. We still speak in the Church of sides men. There are churches in this diocese that still have a policy that only men can be wardens. There are still, Bethany, you're going to swallow a fly like that. There are churches in this diocese that still will not have a woman celebrate communion at their altar. Can you imagine that? And I don't know this for a fact, but I would absolutely guarantee that there are churches that would not have a priest, male or female, celebrating communion if the congregation knew they were gay. We put up so many barriers. God is looking for opportunity. He is not looking for barriers. God is looking to do something new, not to revivify what is old. There's a passage in the book of the prophet Isaiah that says something like this. I love it. I learned it from a guy by the name of Marnie Patterson, Canadian Anglican evangelist. In Isaiah, God is speaking to the prophet, and he says, you know, I'm about to do a new thing. Watch. You can see it happening right now. Isn't that amazing? You know, watch. I'm about to do a new thing. You could see it happening right now. And what Marnie said at the conference that I was attending, where he used that as his passage for the sermon, the talk, he said, God is doing a new thing now in the church. God is wanting the churches to be new. And he spoke of generational Christianity. And he said that, and he was quite right, of course, Christianity is one generation from extinction. Because if this generation doesn't pass it off to the next generation, it'll cease to exist. But he says it has to be passed off. And society is no longer doing the passing off. It will have to be individual Christians sharing with other people the message of the gospel and calling people to come into relationship with God. And so St. Mary's, that's our task, to get the message out there. Now I got to tell you, when I was putting this together for this morning, I had a problem. Because the next step in this sermon should be, okay, if it's true that we need to be able to get it out there, or need to be getting it out there, that launches into a whole other sermon. How do we do that? How do we do that? And, well, I could keep you here for another 45 minutes. Well, it's not been 45 minutes yet. And that'll be for another sermon. But that is our task. And I'm just going to give you one example of something I would love to do. Every now and then I look at myself and I laugh, because there's so many things that I would love to do and I just don't have the courage to do. But some of them aren't so outrageous that they're actually possible. I would love to come up with a poster, not a big poster, not a fancy poster, not even necessarily colored, but just sort of go around the West Island and staple it to telephone poles. The wooden type, not the metal type, that wouldn't work. And the poster would say, we don't have a lot of money for advertising. But even if we did, we wouldn't spend it on advertising, we'd spend it on the poor. If you think that's a good idea, join us. If you don't, stay home. I'd love to do something like that and just sort of see what the reaction is. But I got to tell you, it sounds so sarcastic that people, primarily in the church, would go, there would be such a sharp intake of breath at something so blunt that it would suck the window glass right out of the windows. But there comes a point where you've got to say, here's the bottom line, folks. Here's the brass tacks. And the bottom line in the brass tacks is this. God wants me to change. God wants you to change. He wants all of us to take responsibility for our lives. Stop blaming the way we were toilet trained. Stop blaming the Parti Québécois. Stop blaming bad bishops. Stop blaming the ordination of gays and blessing of same-sex unions and all the rest of the things that we blame for all the problems. To take responsibility and to acknowledge that God is calling each and every one of us to a changed, to a transformed life. No excuses. Take responsibility. Acknowledge ownership. And move on from there. Because that is the only place that you will genuinely move on from. And I truly believe that when the church does that, says, here's the essence of what Christianity is. And I mess up time and time and time again. But this is what I am shooting for. This is what I'm trying for. And I'm not giving up because it's right, because it's God. I believe that when the church and churches start living like that, then we'll see not a revivification of the churches, but a true renewal of gospel communities. Final story. We once had a family join the parish. The wife happened to be daughter of a bishop. They were so committed to the Lord that when they all die, Jesus would stand up off his seat at the right hand of God and say, you guys belong here more than I do. That was slightly facetious. I thought maybe you'd smile. They know the gospel. They knew the gospel. They knew what was right and all the rest of it. And they wanted to be in a position of leadership at St. Mary's. It wasn't going to happen. Because one of my conditions for leadership at St. Mary's is you don't get to lead until you first metaphorically change the toilet paper in the bathrooms. You got to be a servant before you're a leader. And the wife in particular, she wanted to organize a Bible study. She was going to renew St. Mary's by organizing women's Bible studies. And I said, in order for you to organize a Bible study, which I think is a great idea, organizing Bible studies, you got to be in a Bible study. And it became obvious that she did not want to be led. She wanted to lead. And absolutely refused in any way to be accountable. That's a recipe for disaster. It will not surprise you to know that a couple of years later, that family felt called to another parish where the gospel was being preached. Unlike St. Mary's, where clearly the gospel wasn't being preached. Because they wanted to be challenged. They did not want to be challenged. They wanted to be able to look at each other and everybody in the pews and pat themselves and each other on the back and say, "You got it right." They just wanted to be affirmed exactly where they were. If you look at the Bible, that is the last thing you see. You see God, you see Jesus, the Holy Spirit, always challenging people to go further, to dig deeper, to be changed, to go places that you never imagined you could possibly go. And when you get there, to that promised land, metaphorical or literal, you'll see God, and you'll meet God, and God will say to you, "See? Told you you could do it." Now let's pray. God, today I pray for your church, particularly for St. Mary's. With all our ups and downs and our successes and our failures, it's really clear that no matter what else, we aren't doing the best job of connecting your message with the community around us. And so today I pray for a desire to do that. A passion to share your message with people in our community. And it is so easy to look at all the huge churches like Lakeview and Church of the Nations and all those that are super churches and say, what do they have that we don't? Well, there is only one gospel, so whatever else is going on there, who knows? But it is your gospel. So I pray for this community. I pray for people who feel estranged from St. Mary's. I pray for people within our congregation who are facing or trying to avoid facing life issues. I pray for our province and our world. I pray for people who are sick. But above all today, Lord, I pray that everybody here would discover the particular ministry that you have called them to, whatever that may be. And that we would be willing to face whatever challenge we need to, so that your will be done in this place. In Jesus' name, amen.